So today, Hendo is going to be unlocking the dark arts of water chemistry and show how easy every brewer can achieve great results. So I'm going to pass it over to you now, Hendo. Any questions, please stick them into the Q&A and we shall ask Hendo to answer them once he's finished his presentation. So over to you, Hendo.
That's awesome. Thanks, Charles. I'm really grateful to be here today talking to you guys about brewing water chemistry. I'm just going to share my screen here so that you can see the PowerPoint I've got there. Today we're going to talk about, we're going to demystify brewing water chemistry once and for all, and give you some insights as to how to adjust your brewing water for maximum flavour. Just to give you a quick overview, look, I speak quite fast. We've got a pretty short session on, so I move pretty quickly, but don't stress. I like the sessions to be interactive. I can see the chat window here on the other screen. In fact, let's do a little bit of a quick tech check now. If you can type into the chat window, GTG, which means good to go, that'll tell me that you're all here and listening and I can see you. And that's how you can talk to me while I'm talking to you. Yep, use the chat. And at the end, I will stay for a Q&A for as long as you need and that sort of thing. And that's totally cool. So without recapping too much of what Charles has already spoken about, my company is called Rockstar Brewer. It's named after my clients, not after me, funnily enough. I don't call myself a consultant. A lot of my clients already know how to brew beer, so I don't really call myself a consultant. Rather, I'm a brewer coach. I help talented brewers get that extra 5% and make world-class beer. As Charles said, been a professional brewer for over a decade. I used to run a brewing company called Brew. That's the thing that you can see on the wall there. That failed back in 2016. So I have a pretty good insight as to how tough how tough it is to run a brewing business. I brewed the Gabs People's Choice Award winning beer in 2015, won the AIBA Champion Gypsy Brewer Trophy in 2016. I judged, that's internationally, that's how I met Charles. Used to be a shampoo tester, gave up when this fell out. Maybe those things are related, who knows. If you want to catch some of the things that I do, check out my YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube/Rockstar Brewer and you can see all the stuff that I do there. That's about to fire up again. So let's dive into brewing water chemistry, right? Just want to give you an insight into some 3 common problems that brewers have when they start dealing with brewing water chemistry. Every brewer knows that it's important to get your brewing water chemistry right. And we, in modern craft beer, we make so many different styles of beer, and each style of beer has its own water chemistry requirements. And so brewers will basically blindly go and sort of add salts into the mash, sometimes elsewhere. Sometimes we use acids or we use acidulated malt, and we add very precise, we're very good at, writing on our brew sheets, the precise amounts that we want to add into our mash, for instance. But a lot of brewers rarely know why they add particular salts and acid, and even more so, even less so, they don't know why, how much, right? So to give an example, I was speaking with a client the other day, new client, and I was asking him to describe his pale ale recipe. And I said, okay, cool. And we described the malt and that sort of thing and hops. And I said, so do you add gypsum in the mash? He goes, yeah. I said, oh, how much? He goes, 150 grams. And I went, oh, that's cool. Why 150 grams? And couldn't really answer that question as to why he basically added 150 grams of gypsum into his mash for that particular beer. And so that's kind of what I mean when I say that brewers rarely know why they add particular salts and less so how much. And so problem number 2, a lot of brewers see water chemistry as a dark art. And to be fair, there's a lot of noise out there when it comes to brewing water chemistry knowledge. There's a hell of a lot of YouTube videos on trying to sort of, adjust water in particular ways and that sort of thing. If you read, say, John Palmer's book as well, which I believe is an excellent resource for brewing water chemistry knowledge, there's a lot going on in that book, and it can be very overwhelming because if they talk about things like hardness and alkalinity and sulfates and chlorides and chloramines, there's so many things to worry about that you can just basically just shut down and go, why am I, sort of worried about this? But the thing is that brewers generally, don't really have an understanding of what's important in your water. And when I say your water, I'm talking about the water that's coming into your brewery that you brew with. And more importantly, what's not important, okay? And so trying to lift the veil on seeing brewing water chemistry as a dark art is one of the most important things that I do in my role as a brewer coach, because brewers spend a lot of time thinking about the malt and the yeast and the hops, but they rarely pay much attention to the water, you see. But the thing is that if you have a beer that's, say, 5% alcohol, well, it's 95% water. And therefore it's the most abundant ingredient in your beer. So in that respect, it's really important that you get it right, and get a good understanding and adjust your water chemistry with conviction. And so problem number 3 is a lot of brewers try to target a particular historical city's water profile. And I say to a lot of people when I talk about water chemistry to them is like, why are you trying to replicate Dortmund water or Dublin water or Burton-on-Trent water or Pilsen water? More often than not, those brewers hated their own water. So why are you trying to replicate that particular water? For them, the makeup of their particular water, and if I sort of draw Burton-on-Trent as a particular example, very high sulfate level water, what they did there was basically made beers that suited the raw water, whereas modern brewers, we've got access to the ability to be able to have our water analysed, and we can manipulate our water to whatever style of beer we happen to be brewing. So there's really not much point in trying to target a particular historical city's water profile, okay? And so the thing that can happen from there is, well, if I can't target a particular city's water profile and there's so much noise around brewing water chemistry knowledge and that sort of thing, and what can happen is you can get a real lack of understanding as to what your actual objectives are when you are trying to adjust your brewing water for a particular style. And so what generally happens is brewers start to guess. And when brewers start to guess, it leads to kind of unexpected flavour outcomes. And so what that means is that your beer will wind up not tasting its absolute best. And it doesn't matter what malt and hops and yeast you happen to put into your beer. If your water's not adjusted right for the particular style you're trying to brew to, then it's not really it's not going to get you really very far. So yeah. But one of the things that I work a lot with my clients is I help them to master brewing water chemistry. It's one of the 9 accelerators in the Rockstar Brewer system. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And the opportunity that you guys have as brewers is you can actually adjust your brewing water with conviction, knowing the objectives that you are trying to achieve, and make the beer that you currently make even better from the very next time you go and brew it. And so what you can do is you can take some of this knowledge you're going to get today, and you can basically apply that knowledge. Don't change any other ingredient in your beer. Just keep everything else the same. Just change the brewing water chemistry, and your beer will taste completely different from the very next time you brew it. Oh, this is Dave. Dave's at Aether Brewing here in Brisbane, and I like Dave. He's an absolute legend. I have a lot of fun working with him. And so when Dave started his brewery up in the northern suburbs of Brisbane, up in Northgate, I was working with him on some of his beers and scaling up his recipes and that sort of thing. And we noticed that we were getting a bit of a metallic note in some of his beers, particularly the lighter styles like lagers and that sort of thing. And it was very intermittent. And it took a few months for Dave. We got his water tested, and we spent a bit of time trying to diagnose where this metallic taste was coming from. And it turns out that after that, Dave was sort of calling the local water authority, wound up speaking to the right engineer at his local water authority. He learned that there was a 120-year-old cast iron water main going up the street into his brewery, and it was rusting on the inside, and flecks of rust would come off the pipe and go into his brewery very intermittently, which would make some of the batches of beer taste metallic. And so there's a really good lesson to learn here that he's diagnosed the issue. He's fixed his brewing water chemistry, and he won Champion Medium Brewery earlier this year at the Royal Queensland Food and Wine Show Beer Awards. He does very well at the Australian International Beer Awards as well. It's a real testament as to how getting your water chemistry right can help you to brew world-class beer. So let me give you a few principles as to what you need to do in your brewery in order to get a better understanding of your brewing water chemistry and transform your beers into something absolutely amazing. So principle number one is get to know your own brewing water. So take Dave as an example. If you're using your local water authority's report as the basis for making your adjustments to your water chemistry, that's not the complete picture because it doesn't take into account your pipes in your street, in your suburbs water source, and also your own brewery's water treatment. So, for example, you may use something as simple as just simple carbon filtration. I know a lot of breweries up in Asia use RO because they're using groundwater and that sort of thing. And it's really important that you get, no matter what your water treatment is or where you happen to be, get your water tested in the four walls of your brewery, take the sample from there, and then you'll know exactly what's going on, because that's basically your blank canvas in which all beers are going to be painted onto. Oh, that was a good analogy. So principle number two is, rather than have all of this noise around why you're trying to make adjustments to your brewing water, focus on the two outcomes, right? And the two flavor numbers that you need to focus on with regards to adjusting your brewing water chemistry is your beer pH and your sulfate to chloride ratio. That's it, all right? There are other things which are of secondary importance, which you can tweak later. But if you just start with those two things, beer pH and your sulfate to chloride ratio, you will transform your beers and they'll taste absolutely amazing. All right, they're two flavor numbers. Principle number three, understand the difference between alkalinity and pH, right? So we all have a pH meter in our brewery and that sort of thing. But alkalinity of your water is super important because if you think of alkalinity and pH like an old school car radio dial, like you can see on the screen there, pH is basically the frequency that you're trying to hit, and alkalinity is how hard or how far you have to turn the dial to tune into that station, right? And that's why when it comes to your water, alkalinity is much more important than hardness. Because hardness is just basically your calcium and magnesium content and that sort of thing. And also why your water pH is pretty much irrelevant when it comes to brewing. The only time that water pH becomes an issue when you're brewing is if your water pH happens to be above about 8.3 when carbonates can start to dissolve in it. And that's why water pH is largely irrelevant, but water alkalinity makes more of a difference when it comes to trying to achieve beer flavor outcomes. And when it comes to alkalinity and pH, the color of the beer that you're trying to brew matters a lot, because when you're using pale malts like Pilsner malt and ale malt and Marisotto and all that sort of thing, left with the water left untreated, they'll actually create a mash with a very high pH. And roast malts are acidic, and they'll actually acidify the mash and lower the pH of the mash and the wort as well. However, the thing is that pale beers favour a lower beer pH, and darker beers generally favour a higher beer pH. And so the whole thing is basically flipped. So if you're making a pale beer, chances are you're going to have to employ some method of acidification in order to give you an example. If you're going to make like a nice crispy boy lager, chances are you're going to have to acidify your mash, probably your wort as well, depending upon your water, in order to make that nice crisp tasting beer. If you brew a lager and your mash pH and your beer pH is if your mash pH is in the high 5s, and you ferment the beer out and the beer pH winds up being in the high 4s, which I've seen quite a lot, the beer tastes really flabby, right? You want to have this nice crisp lager, but you wind up with a really flabby tasting beer. And that's why beer pH is one of the most important flavor numbers, because if you think about spaghetti bolognese, right? I love spaghetti bolognese. It's got, beef and tomato and maybe some red wine and, maybe some onions and some water and all that sort of thing. And if you try spaghetti bolognese sauce that you buy at the supermarket that comes in a can, it's very acidic. It's not very flavorful, but it's built for a really long shelf life, and I guess that's the outcome they're trying to achieve. Now, I cook spaghetti bolognese at home. I like to think I'm a pretty good home chef. I use a little bit of red wine. Maybe I'll use some red wine vinegar. It depends on the day, how I'm feeling. I use some, good beef and some good tomatoes, and I'm pretty good. My spaghetti bolognese sauce is pretty good. But if you go to a really expensive Italian restaurant and you try their spaghetti bolognese, or you try their lasagna or something like that, and it tastes absolutely amazing. Everything's in balance and no one flavor dominates, and everything's it just works out really, really well, and it tastes absolutely amazing. And a lot of that is to do with pH and salts and acidity and alkalinity and that sort of thing, right? And so those three examples of spaghetti bolognese sauce, they're all made from the same ingredients. So all have beef in them. They all have tomatoes in it. They all have water in it. And so there's not really that much difference, but the chef from that really expensive Italian restaurant has really honed in the importance of pH and trying to get all of the flavors to work in concert with one another. Principle number 4, when it comes to doing calculations, and you should do calculations when it comes to adjusting your brewing water chemistry. There's lots of tools out there, but I recommend Brewing water. I know you can do, let me get that out of the way. I know you can use things like, I know Beersmith has a water chemistry tool in it. I know that, what's that? Beer Alchemy, Brew Tools, all the homebrew recipe writing applications all have some form of brewing water chemistry sort of calculation in it, and even Beersmith. And I use Beersmith for writing beer recipes and that sort of thing. I find it really good, but I don't use it for water chemistry, and I certainly don't click the button that says calculate it for me, because I think that the adjustment of your brewing water chemistry, because it impacts flavor directly, should be done by the skill of a brewer, but the calculations can be done by a spreadsheet. So Brewing water is developed by a guy called Martin Brungard, and he's an absolute genius. This spreadsheet is phenomenal. There's a free version out there that you can get, but the paid version is just phenomenal. If you get the paid version, it basically allows you to store all your recipes in the one file rather than have all these different files for each different beer recipe. And it costs like $10 US. It's the best $10 a brewer could ever spend. And it's a really good way to get an understanding of where your water is and where it should be, and away you go. So when you couple this with getting your water tested, and understanding alkalinity pH and understanding the 2 flavour numbers, you can actually use brewing water with a lot of conviction and actually come up with some really good outcomes. And so I highly recommend using brewing water. Principle number 5, and this is a really common mistake that I see a lot of brewers make, is treat all your brewing water, not just your mash, right? Lots of brewers, they add salts or acid or something like that into the mash, but they don't think about the other water that actually goes into your pint when you're drinking it, right? And so that's like, it's your mash liquor. It's also your sparge liquor. It's also any dilution liquor if you're doing a little bit of high gravity brewing and you're diluting at the end of the boil or in the whirlpool or something like that. So it's really important that you tally up those different places where you use water during the brewing process, and that you treat all of that water. Because if you just put salts and acid in the mash and don't treat your sparge water or your dilution liquor on brew day, you're not treating all the water. And therefore, what you calculate isn't actually what's going to be reflected in the final product, right? So it's really important that you treat all of your brewing water, okay? So these 5 principles is basically a way for you to get better control over your brewing water, create some amazing beer outcomes, and brew some amazing beer. I've got a Q&A coming up, so if you've got a question that you want to ask me, feel free to punch it into the chat or into the question Q&A window, and you can start typing now, and by the time I finish this slide, then we can jump straight into questions. So basically, your next steps are here, right? So basically, we're living in some pretty unique times, right? I've already helped dozens of breweries all over the world build their brand loyalty, they grow sales, and they have a lot of fun brewing beer by helping them install the Rockstar Brewer system. Now, it's not software, it's basically, the Rockstar Brewer system is 9 accelerators that a brewery needs in order to brew world-class beer that sells really, really well and create sustainable brewing businesses, okay? So if you're interested, I'm hosting a free crash course this Thursday. It's basically at this time on Thursday in 2 days' time. If you put into the comments water, I will get back to you with the details, and I can run through with you all the other 8 accelerators in the Rockstar Brewer system, and how you can install them in your own brewery in the next 90 days. Okay, so that pretty much concludes this session. I am going to jump over to some Q&A now. So I will stop sharing my screen. Yes, keep typing into the chat if you would like to know more about Thursday's session. That's totally cool. Just type water, and I'll get Charles to, I'll get the info from Charles, and I'll get back to you on that sort of thing. So question here from Miyoshi Makusi. I really hope that I pronounced your name properly, mate. The question is, what range of alkalinity is desired in water pH? So remember, brewing water pH isn't important. When it comes to your brewing water alkalinity, lower is better, okay? Because if you have less alkalinity in your brewing water, it means that it takes less effort to acidify your mash and your wort, and therefore your beer, in a way that you can hit those targets that you're aiming for, okay? So I won't give you a number, but I'll say less alkalinity is better. That's why things like RO water is really is a good way to go. If you find that the alkalinity of your local water supply is very high, there's some very interesting stuff going on there. So if you still have a question, I noticed that Charles has just cleared that question, but if you've got a question, just punch it in there. Cool, here's another one, right. Raul Masangkay. Oh God, I really hope I
Masangkay from the Philippines.
Oh, from the Philippines.
Yeah,
G'day.
yeah.
Okay. Nice to meet you. Are there kits out there that you can use to test water? Have you tried them? Do you recommend them? Yeah, there's a couple of ways that you can test your water. I've got a little thing in my cupboard back here, and it's called a Lamont Brew Lab. Brew, I think it's called a Brew Lab. And it's basically some little droppers into your water, into samples of water with little tablets and all that sort of thing, and some calculations that you can do. And it'll tell you how much calcium and sulfate and chloride and all that sort of stuff is in your water. They're pretty cheap. I think I paid about $250 Australian for it and that sort of thing. It works, but it's not particularly precise, all right? So for example, the smallest number that you'll get with regards to sulfate on one of those Lamont kits is only in a range of about 20 parts per million. And that can make a difference between a multi-beer and a hoppy beer. So, if you have nothing else, I suppose that's one way to start. I would say, Raoul, that there would be a company in the Philippines that would test water. And so if you're going to get your water tested, the information that you're going to need is calcium in parts per million, magnesium, sodium, chloride, sulfate, alkalinity. And so there's two alkalinity numbers. There's total alkalinity and a brewer specific term called residual alkalinity. And that's really easy. That's basically your total alkalinity less your hardness, which is your calcium and magnesium. And that's residual alkalinity. And that's what makes, that's the dial for you to tune in for pH. Yeah, I would suggest the preferred way to get your water tested is send it to a proper lab is the best way. There are other bits of kit that you can buy from like Hannah Instruments, but they'll only test calcium, or they'll only test sulfate, and you've got to spend money on each machine and that sort of thing. And that can get expensive. But if you're going to get your water tested, get it tested twice a year, and use a lab that gives you actual numbers. So I hope that helps. So another question here from Jose Mari Cuervo. Thank you for your question. Do you recommend Water, A Comprehensive Guide for Brewers by John Palmer? Yes, it's right there. Absolutely. It's an excellent book. It's where a lot of my brewing water knowledge comes from. It took me a few goes to read John Palmer's book. I don't want to disrespect John Palmer because the guy's a bloody legend. But I tried reading it a couple of times and fell asleep. It's great if you got insomnia, but not so good if you're trying to actually learn something. And so it's a great book. Definitely get it. Definitely read it. What I coach my clients in the Master Water Chemistry Accelerator is how to adjust your brewing water chemistry with conviction in 6 easy steps. Doesn't matter what style of beer you're brewing, 6 easy steps, how to use BRU'N water to achieve those outcomes, and away you go. It's really simple once you know how. So I hope that answers your question. So Mark has asked the question, hi, have you ever tried electrophoresis water to adjust pH? Is it any good? Are you talking about electrolysis? I'm not entirely sure about your particular question there. There's lots of ways in which you can treat water. So Dave, who I mentioned before, who had the issue with the iron in his water, he treats his water now using ion exchange to get rid of the ions in his water. And now but what happens is the iron, as in the metal, gets exchanged for sodium. So now he has that issue to deal with regards to his water chemistry. Luckily, it's not so bad that sodium's easier to deal with than iron, but that's probably the way in which I would go. I hope I answered your question. Feel free to follow up if you wanted to ask something else. Leon says, what's a recommended pH meter for checking mash pH that's affordable for a small scale brewer? That's an excellent question. Try and spend as much money as you possibly can on a pH meter. The very first thing that I work with my brewer clients on is what's called the sacred trilogy of brewing measurements. And that's temperature, gravity, and pH. Those three things, if you do nothing else, you don't have to spend money on $20,000 DO meter or anything like that, if you just get those three things right, and if you're in control of those three numbers right the way through the brewing production process, you will make amazing beer. Okay. And so pH, a lot of brewers obviously look at gravity and they look at temperature, but pH can be something that's not really, it's a bit of an afterthought, but there's so much that the beer will tell you just by knowing the pH, and it will change your beer forever. So, so I would say for a small scale brewer, I would say probably in US dollars, budget at least about $500 US on a pH meter. Try to avoid the ones that home brewers generally use, unless you are actually home brewing. So some examples, I've seen some really good Hannah brand pH meters. They've got one called the Halo, looks like a lollipop. Basically, it's a Bluetooth pH meter, a little black disc and a metal probe on it. And you use your phone as the screen and away you go. They're pretty good. They're a pretty good one to start. There's the pH Cube. They're actually made here in Brendale in Brisbane. They're pretty analog. They've got like dials and stuff on it. If you're a bit of a pH file or something like that, like old audio files, listening to vinyl and that sort of thing. If you can afford it, I really like the Hark pH meters. I think it's the something 30D Hark pH meter. They're about $1,500, or probably about $1,250 US dollars. They're really, really good, right? But do spend some money on a good pH meter. And most importantly, when you buy a pH meter, look after it. They're very, very sensitive, very delicate, and they need to be calibrated every day. One of the other accelerators that I work with my clients on is measure and trust. If you can't trust the data that's being given to you that you measure, then you're not going to make the right decisions. So get a good pH meter and look after it when you do buy it. I hope that answers your question, Leon. An anonymous attendee, Charles, that's interesting, says, what purity grade of these salts are acceptable to be added? Will technical grade suffice? Food grade is the answer. So if you're going to buy gypsum, don't go down to the local hardware store and buy the stuff that you use on clay. Go to a good, any reputable brewery ingredient supplier in whichever country you happen to be in. One of them will sell brewing salts to you. So they'll sell you food grade gypsum, food grade calcium chloride, food grade lactic acid, and that's the grade of what you need to use in your product, because at the end of the day, you're making food, so use food grade. Hope that helps. Oh, how are we going there, Charles?
Oh, looking good. Yep. I had one question which came in earlier when people were registering. They're asking about sour beers and water for sour beers. Do you need to do anything in particular? Because a lot of people are now making sour beers, also wild fermentation as well. Do you need to do anything particular with your water if you're doing sour or wild beers?
Yeah, that's a great question, Charles. Yeah, so the answer is yes. Just because you're making a sour beer doesn't mean that you should ignore your brewing water chemistry and not try to get it right. So remember, if you go back to the two flavor numbers in beer that I mentioned today, so there's beer pH and the sulfate to chloride ratio. Now, if you've got a sour beer, then the beer pH is going to be pretty low, probably in the low 3s, whereas regular non-sour beer is going to be in the low 4s, right? So that's one of the flavor numbers, because that's a flavor outcome that you're trying to achieve. You're making a sour beer, your beer pH target is going to be significantly lower. But you still have to worry about the sulfate to chloride ratio, because the sulfate to chloride ratio determines whether a beer is going to taste malty versus hoppy. It's not the best descriptor to use, but that's the one that a lot of brewers tend to understand. So the more sulfate that you have, the more it's going to accentuate hop bitterness and hop flavor. and that only goes so far, and then beers start tasting astringent, so more is not better. And chlorides accentuate multi-flavors. So to give you an example, if I'm making a lager, just a straight up Munich Helles or something like that, just a drinking beer, I probably target a sulfate to chloride ratio of around 0.8 to 1. If I'm making a pale ale, which would be, just like take your average 5% American style pale ale, if it was 5%, I'd probably target a sulfate to chloride ratio of around 2. And if I step up that beer and add alcohol and add hops, if I go to IPA and sort of that 6 to 7% range, the sulfate to chloride ratio is going to be about 2.3 to 2.5. If I have double IPA up into the 7.5 to sort of 9% range, it's going to be 2.7 to 2.9. That's probably as far as I would want to take it, because the reason why that happens, why you need a higher sulfate to chloride ratio when the alcohol goes up, is that there's more malt. So you've got to counteract that with more sulfate to balance out that sweetness. And ethanol, so alcohol, gives you a perception of body in a beer, and the sulfate helps to cut through that as well from a flavor perspective. So that's a pretty good way to manage your sulfate to chloride ratio depending upon what style of beer you're making. For a sour beer, I'd probably target something pretty balanced. They're not meant to be hoppy beers, and they're certainly not necessarily meant to be multi beers either. So I'd probably, if I was to be honest, I haven't done that many sour beers, and I really should give and modifying the water chemistry for sour beers. But off the bat, I'd probably keep it at a 1-to-1 ratio. Funnily enough, if you are making something like a New England IPA, it's also around a 1-to-1 ratio, but you have to elevate the sulfate and the chloride significantly as well to get that sort of mouthfeel and hop flavor at the same time. Does that help, Charles?
I think it does. Yep, I'm sure
awesome.
It does. Yeah, great.
Can't see any more questions there.
There's just one more. Robert
please.
from the Philippines has popped one into chat, and he was saying water changes frequently as rainy season comes and goes in the Philippines, and testing is extremely slow and difficult regarding logistics.
Yes.
And he's based out in Palawan, so it probably takes him even longer to get his things done.
Yeah.
What alternative test kits would you recommend? What test kit would you recommend for him?
If you're in a place in a part of the world where water testing is either expensive or slow or something like that, and where the water changes frequently, it doesn't even matter if you're here in Brisbane, the water changes very frequently because here in southeast Queensland, we have a series of dams all having different water chemistry. And we also have a desalination plant down near the New South Wales border. And all the water is interconnected and it mixes, right? And so the water here, even here, changes quite frequently. And so if I was in Robert's situation, I'd probably go and obtain one of those Lamotte testing kits, and that way it's something that's there in your brewery, and you can test your water within about sort of 20 minutes, 30 minutes or something like that. There's a few little tablets and shaking and all sorts of stuff you have to do. So if you're in that situation where lab testing isn't practical or timely, and your water changes frequently, that's probably something that I would use. And if you do go down that path, I would actually create like a spreadsheet that says what date you took the sample and track how it changes over time, right? And then what will happen is you'll be able to sort of build up a little bit of knowledge as to when the wet season comes along, what you can expect the water to be like, and when the dry season comes along, what you can expect the water to be like. And sort of build that experience over time.
So test and track.
Test and track,
Test and
totally.
track. That
Yeah,
seems
data.
to be
Yeah.
the buzzword for this year, I think, isn't it?
I'm a very, very data-driven brewer. Like I used to be an IT engineer prior to becoming a professional brewer, and I'm a bit of a nut for data and tracking data and seeing how things change over time.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Hendo. That was very illuminating.
Awesome. No dramas, Charles. Thanks for having
Th-
us.
Thanks for joining. Thanks for coming along, and thanks everybody for attending. Those of you who put water into the chat bar, we'll get back to you. I'll pop you in contact with Hendo so he can follow up with you. So there's a few guys who are quite interested to follow up with you there, Hendo. So
yeah, no dramas. Well, I'll reach out with an email or something like that. So
yeah, that's great. All right, well, thanks very much. Thanks everyone for turning up. We'll draw the session to a close now.